Hello, my name's Wendy Thickett and I have a husband called Mark Thickett who was diagnosed with young onset dementia at the age of 54. We have two sons together who are married and both have a wife. And I'm just here to tell you a little bit about our journey with dementia and how it's affected our family. So our journey started by me noticing that Mark was starting to have symptoms of something. We weren't sure what it was, but I knew he wasn't right. One of the things that happened with Mark was that Mark had always been a very precise driver. He had learnt to drive with his dad, and his dad was a very precise man who liked to do everything properly and everything in the correct order. One of the things Mark did when he was driving was he always went up and down the gears properly. So if he was in third gear and you were approaching a roundabout, he would go to second and then first, and then he would come to a halt. And he suddenly started not doing that anymore. So we would approach a roundabout and he would suddenly move into first gear and obviously stall the car and things like that. For some people, it wouldn't have been a trigger or a sign that something wasn't right. But for me, because it wasn't Mark and hadn't been for all the years we've been married, it was very obvious that something wasn't right. We had other symptoms as well. The obvious things like forgetting people's names, forgetting people's faces, not going to places when he was expected to, doing unusual things, the usual sort of things. So after a while, I persuaded Mark that it would be a good idea to go and see the GP. We had an appointment, and after a bit of persuasion, the GP suggested that we go to the memory clinic. So for 2 years on and off, we were at the memory clinic. We had appointments. Mark had lots of scans. We had tests. We had all kinds of things. And then in the December, Mark went off to an appointment that I couldn't attend at the memory clinic. And he came back saying that he'd been diagnosed with anxiety and depression. And that was definitely what it was. That was what all the symptoms were. And I just went, no, I just don't believe it. So after a bit of a few phone calls, I managed to speak to the consultant. And the consultant said, well, I don't know what else you want me to do. We've done majority of the tests we can do. I asked the consultant if there was anything at all that he could do, and he eventually agreed to do a PET scan on Mark. In the January, we went for the results of the scan, and we were told that Mark had young onset Alzheimer's. We were absolutely devastated, and I remember that we left that appointment and we went and sat in the car park, and we were so stunned. We just sat there for ages. We couldn't talk to each other. We just were devastated. And of course, we had to come home and tell our sons, who at that point were 26 and 29, that their father had Alzheimer's. So here we were as a family in shock, as you can imagine, from our diagnosis. We also had an issue with Mark's work. Mark was diagnosed in the January, and the previous December there had been an incident at work where Mark had forgot a very basic step in what he was doing. And it had caused quite a lot of problems at work, and it was very upsetting for us all. And of course, with our diagnosis, we had an explanation for what had happened, because of course he'd forgotten to do a basic step because Mark has Alzheimer's. But unfortunately, his company had already moved him off that project and onto something that they felt was less important in case it happened again. So we were struggling with the work problems and the diagnosis. And coincidentally, I happened to get a phone call from a Dementia Forward. Actually, they rang me about my father, who has some memory issues as well, and they've been working with him. And in the course of the conversation, I chatted with the lady and explained about Mark's diagnosis. And fortunately, obviously, they were able to help us. We had a worker come along and have a chat with us and meet Mark. And she'd given us lots of help and suggestions on to how we moved forward with things. And one of the things that we were told about was that the Dementia Forward actually run a group on a Wednesday that are specifically for young onset dementia patients. And so, it was suggested that if Mark would like to go along, he could. Mark resisted for a while. He didn't feel at that point that he wanted to take a day off work to do that, because he felt work was very important, obviously. But gradually, as the year went on, and it was obvious that work had sidelined Mark, I managed to persuade him that actually maybe having a day off one day a week wasn't going to be a problem, and that it would be good for him to join this group. So in the September, finally, Mark decided to go along one Wednesday and join the group. And I can honestly say he never looked back, because I think suddenly he had somewhere where he could talk to somebody about the things that were bothering him, about his diagnosis, about work, about everything. He met other people who were in a similar situation to him, which of course, again, it gives you a new perspective on things. And as a family, we had some support. Suddenly we had somewhere we could turn when we had questions, somebody to talk to ourselves about things. So in January this year, we got to the point where Mark was needing some personal care. And as a family, we found this incredibly difficult. Mark was living in a household where we had a granddaughter who was running around. Mark was having accidents. He needed help with everything. He needed showering, you name it, everything. I mean, at this point, Mark could not really do an awful lot for himself. And as a family, we were beginning to feel the tension and the stress. So I made a phone call to the local council to ask for a care needs assessment, which they eventually organised, and a social worker came along. And we had a meeting, and during the meeting, I felt that this social worker just didn't understand where we were, what we were doing, how we were feeling. We tried so hard to tell her that we were at crisis point and that things were deteriorating, but she just didn't seem to understand, and I don't really know why. Anyway, I asked for another social worker because I wasn't happy with the care needs assessment. 3 social workers later, we eventually got a social worker who really seemed to listen to what we were saying. We had a family meeting. We had a family meeting without Mark, which was the first time we'd had the meeting without Mark present. And I feel we were able to say things that we hadn't been able to say in the previous meetings because of being aware that Mark was listening. And also at this point, this is 8 months after we started this process, Dementia Forward kindly spoke to this social worker and really made it clear that we were at crisis point. We were at breaking point, actually, never mind a crisis. The family and the whole family. This was not just one of us or 2 of us. We had 5 adults here looking after Mark on a daily basis, 24/7, and we couldn't do it anymore. We had just got to the point, 7.5 years we've been doing it, and it was just too much for us. Mark needed professional support, and we just weren't able to give it to him. In our conversations with Dementia Forward, and there were many over those few months, there were emails, there were meetings, chatting, support, advice. It had been brought to our notice that a young onset unit had opened at a care home in York. And when we got to the point that we really knew that it was residential care was Mark's option for the future, my daughter-in-law and I decided to go and visit this unit. And we went in, and we had a lovely visit, had a long chat with the manager. And when we came out, I sat in the car and cried and said to my daughter-in-law, this is the place for Mark. I knew within half an hour that that was the right place for Mark to be. And partly it was because the manager was saying to me, what does Mark like to do? What does Mark like to eat? What is he interested in? What has he done in the past? Not what medication does he need? Not how often do you have to remind him to go to the loo? How often do you need to change him? He was asking me personal things about Mark as a person, not about Mark with dementia.